A very good morning to Sir Mustafa. I'm Santya Ravichandran. I will be presenting on Introduction, Mission, Objective of Islamic Finance Service Board, which is IFSB. Introduction. Based in Kuala Lumpur, established on 3rd November 2002. Starts operation on 10th March 2003. It serves as an international standard-setting board of regulatory and supervisory agency. As at April 2016, the 190 members of IFSB comprise 66 regulatory and supervisory authorities, 8 international intergovernmental organizations, and 116 market players. Malaysia, the host country of the IFSB, has enacted a law known as the Islamic Finance Service Board Act 2002. The mission of IFSB is to promote the stability and resilience of the Islamic financial service industry. Secondly, seek to achieve its mission through the issuance and facilitating the implementation of global and prudential and supervisory standards and other initiatives that foster knowledge sharing and cooperation. The objective of IFSB. Firstly, to promote the development of a prudent and transparent Islamic financial service industry. Secondly, to provide guidance on the effective supervision and regulation of institutions offering Islamic financial product and to develop for the Islamic financial services industry. Thirdly, to enhance and coordination initiatives to develop instruments and procedures for efficient operation and risk management. Then, to encourage cooperation amongst members countries in developing the Islamic financial service industry. Lastly, to facilitate training and personnel development skills in areas relevant to the effective regulation of the Islamic financial services industry and related markets. The need for core principles in Islamic capital markets. Firstly, Islamic financial service industry IFSI has progressed rapidly, embracing not just Muslim majority economics but also other emerging markets and advanced economics as well. Secondly, business volume and number of institutions offering Islamic financial service increased. An enhanced variety of the product and services offered. Improved legal and regulatory infrastructure, a new initiatives for international cooperation. IFSI has gained significant market share. Now, constitutions an important building block of the financial system in many jurisdictions. Then, increased challenges for the resiliences and stability of financial systems and for the protection of their users. Next, existing IOSCO principles are inadequate to deal with the specifics of Islamic capital markets. Lastly, core principles for Islamic capital market CPICM is needed to solve these problems.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Farhana Alia binti Adiwira and I will be presenting on core principles of Islamic capital markets. Let's begin. The core principles for Islamic capital market are a set of principles that are set out in the published standard of IFSB 21, titled The Core Principle for Islamic Finance Regulation of the Islamic Capital Market Segment. The Islamic Financial Services Board issued IFSB 21 in December of 2018. The core principles of Islamic capital market is used to regulate and supervise the Islamic capital market while taking into consideration specificities of Islamic finance, which, at the same time, complements IOSCO's principles. The IOSCO's objectives and principles of securities regulations sets out 38 principles of securities regulations, which are based upon 3 objectives of securities regulations. The first objective is protecting investors. Secondly, ensuring that markets are fair, efficient and transparent. And thirdly, reducing systemic risk. Before I explain further on core principles for Islamic capital markets, I would firstly like to explain what is the Islamic capital market. Well, conventionally, the term capital market refers to a financial market where debt and equity are demanded and supplied. A capital market helps investors find a platform for making their investments and help both borrowers and investors by channeling funds from those with excess funds to those who are in need of those funds. On the other hand, the Islamic capital market is where Sharia-compliant financial assets are transacted. It works parallel to the conventional market and helps investors find Sharia-compliant investment opportunities. Now, moving on, there are a total of 38 principles published for the regulation of Islamic capital market. The 38 principles are broken down into 10 distinct categories, which are, firstly, principles relating to the regulator, secondly, principles for self-regulation, thirdly, principles for Sharia governance, fourthly, principles for enforcement of securities regulation, fifth, principles for cooperation in regulation, sixth, principles for issuers, seventh, principles for auditors, credit rating agencies and other information service providers, eighth, principles for Islamic collective investment schemes, ninth, principles for market intermediaries, and 10th, which is the final one, the principles for secondary and other markets. Now, I will briefly explain a summary of all the principles. Firstly, in principles relating to the regulator, the standard explains roles, duties, and responsibilities of a regulator of the Islamic capital market. It also explains how a regulator should conduct their services, and it urges regulators to avoid conflict of interest and misalignment of incentives. Next, in principles for self-regulation, these principles apply if an entity has one or several key features of a self-regulatory organization. An entity is classified as a self-regulatory organization if it has been given the power or responsibility to regulate, and its rules are subject to meaningful sanctions regarding any part of the securities market or industry. In principles relating to Sharia governance, it states that a regulator should require Sharia governance is upheld for all products, activities, services, and or institutions implicitly or explicitly claiming Sharia compliance in the Islamic capital market. There is no IOSCO principle that is equivalent to this principle. We then have principles for the enforcement of securities regulation. This principle was laid down to ensure that regulators demonstrate adequate surveillance mechanisms and an effective enforcement program to identify and respond to instances where they fail to comply with their Sharia compliance requirements. Next, the principles for cooperation in regulation is used to address cooperation amongst regulators and their domestic or foreign counterparts for investigations, enforcements, and for supervision and other regulatory purposes. While for principles for issuers, these core principles in Islamic capital markets are about the information that issuers should disclose to investors when they invest in securities and on an ongoing basis. Next, principle for auditor, credit rating agencies, and other information service providers is information that investors may rely on when making investment decisions. They differ from core principles for issuers in that they relate to information that is not generally prepared by issuers themselves. Within modern financial markets, there exist entities that analyze, evaluate, or provide assurance of information for investors about issuers or their securities in order to help investors make their investment decisions. The principles for Islamic collective investment schemes requires regulations to set standards for those involved in the operation of Islamic collective investment schemes and the marketing of Islamic collective investment schemes' interests. It also emphasizes for regulators to ensure and seek protection for investors. Next, we have principles for market intermediaries, which sets out requirements related to entry criteria, capital and prudential requirements, conduct of business, ongoing supervision and discipline of market intermediaries, and the consequences of default and financial failure. Finally, we have principles for secondary and other markets. The core principles of Islamic capital markets under this section is intended to promote the objectives whereby regulators in all jurisdictions acknowledge that investors want fair, efficient, and transparent markets.
The first objective of CPICM is to provide a minimum international standard for sound supervisory practices for the regulation and assessment of ICM. And the second objective is to protect the consumers and other stakeholders by ensuring that the claim to Sharia compliance made by any ICM products or services is supported by appropriate disclosures. And the third objective is to enhance the sound and stability of ICM. To continue, CPICM is used by jurisdiction for a benchmark as assessing the quality of regulatory and supervisory system and also to achieve a baseline level of sound. Besides that, CPICM also assists Ifsb members' jurisdiction in International Monetary Fund and World Bank Financial Sector Assessment Program. Secondly, for self-assessment. Thirdly, to reviews conducted by private third parties and also peer reviews conducted.
Hi, I'm Monisha Nair and I'm going to present about the general approach of core principle of Islamic Capital Market, CPICM. There are some international organization of Security Commission, IOSCO, that are amended for several reasons such as Sharia reason, net asset value money market funds, and because of its applicability to conventional and Islamic finance. This IOSCO is amended because it is not a feature in Islamic finance or Islamic capital market under Sharia, and there is also a so-called stable net asset value money market funds under this IOSCO which do not comply with Sharia's rules and principle. IOSCO standard is also applicable to conventional and Islamic finance, and it provides additional background on relevant issues, but these references should not be taken as implying that the standards are all in respect to Islamic finance. Next, there are two IOSCO principles that is omitted, which are the Principle 28 and Principle 38. Principle 28 on hedge funds, which reflects the short selling and use of derivatives, makes it impossible. And whereas Principle 38 is on clearing and settlement, where the assessment in this area is against the principle of financial market infrastructure. So, amendments are made of the level of supporting text and key questions rather than on the principles. As for the changes, IFSB may be defining standards in more detail in future when the CPICM are at its first definitive standards. Next, revision to IFSB standards and guidance will be designed to strengthen the regulatory regime. And finally, supervisor authorities are encouraged to move toward the adoption of updated and new international supervisory standards.
Now, I will be presenting on the objectives of Islamic capital markets regulations. The three objectives of IOSCO are closely related, and in some aspects they overlap. Many of the requirements that ensure fair, efficient and transparent markets also provides investor protection and reduces systemic risk. Similarly, many measures that reduces systemic risk also provides investor protection. However, in supervising the Islamic capital markets, the objectives needs to be approached in ways that recognizes the specificities of Islamic finance. For example, for the purposes of protection of investors, the claim of Sharia compliance of Islamic capital markets products and services needs to be sound, based on appropriate due process and backed by adequate disclosures to the investors. Hence, the objective of Islamic capital markets regulations are, firstly, the protection of investors, whereby investors must be protected from misleading, manipulative or fraudulent practices, which includes insider trading, trading ahead of customers, misuse of clients' assets, and misleading claims of Sharia compliance. This can be done by enforcing clarity in contracts related to Islamic capital markets for investors in the event of cases that leads to court. Next, full disclosure of information material to investors. And finally, the complex character of securities transaction and fraudulent schemes requires strong enforcement of securities law. Where a breach of law does occur, investors should be protected through the enforcement of the law. The second objective is ensuring that markets are fair, efficient, and transparent. For example, fairness involves the prevention of improper trading practices. Next, efficiency involves the dissemination of relevant information that is timely and widespread and is reflective in the price formation process. And finally, transparency involves the degree to which information about trading is made publicly available on real-time basis. Finally, the third and last objective is the reduction of systemic risk. The reduction of systemic risk is closely related to the protection of investors. However, risk-taking is essential to ensure an active market, which is why regulators should promote and allow for the effective management of risk and ensure that capital and prudential requirements are sufficient to address appropriate risk-taking, allow the absorption of some losses, and check excessive risk-taking.
I'm Muhammad Azman and I would like to present about the regulatory environment of Ifsb 21. So how the CPICM implemented? So the regulation of Islamic capital market is necessary for the gaining of the three core objectives of capital markets regulation. So unsimilar regulations can force an unjustified burden on markets. The context of regulation should be recognition of the benefits of competition in the marketplace. So it is possible to identify general attributes of effective regulation that are consistent with sound economic growth, like there should be an unnecessarily barriers to enter or exit from markets and products. The market should be open with the widest range of participants. The regulatory bodies should consider the impact of the requirements imposed, and last, there should be an equal regulatory burden on all. It must be appropriate and effective legal and accounting framework within the ICM can operate. The laws and regulation of Islamic capital markets cannot exist in isolation from other laws. It may include framework documentation such as constitution or charters as it appropriates. Lastly, must also be clear guidelines in relation to matters of Sharia within the Islamic capital market. Thank you.
Let's move on to the scope of assessment methodology and intended scope of assessment. The assessment methodology is intended to apply to jurisdictions that have material Islamic capital market. It is applicable to security market, intermediaries, information service providers such as credit rating agencies, and product addressed by the CPICM. The scope of assessment methodology includes the common requirement that applies equally to both Islamic and conventional capital market, where requirements that should be considered for jurisdiction where ICM activities are undertaken. What should be taken into consideration to apply the jurisdiction? Its application should take account of the actual configuration of the market, the stage of their development, participation documents, and take into account of the functional difference between relevant jurisdiction statutory treatment of security and Sharia compliant hedging instrument. The methodology does not apply to markets such as currency, bullion, and physical commodity markets, except to the extent that the security intermediaries use for the customers such as the market. Next, the assessment process and assessment measure. What is the assessment? The assessment is a tool to identify potential gaps, inconsistencies, weaknesses, and areas where further power or authorities may be necessary, and a basis of framing priorities for enhancement or reform to the existing law, regulation, and procedure. CPICM is not intended to be pure checklist. The assessment process consists of the dialogue in which the regulator will explain the Islamic capital market structure, laws, regulatory programs, how the regulator believe its regulatory program address the key question and key issue to meet the objective of the CPICM. The methodology set out clear guidance on the key question that must be answered in the affirmative for a jurisdiction to score a fully, broadly, or partly implemented rating. It is understood that where a key question is applicable, either yes or no, answer to key question use of testing implementation should be augmented by explanation that explain the status of the implementation on the context of particular jurisdiction. And the answer might be qualified to explain any departure for a full yes or a full no response. For the assessment, there are 5 types of assessment category, which is fully implemented, broadly implemented, partly implemented, not implemented, and also not applicable. Let me explain to you the assessment category. The first one is fully implemented. All the assessment criteria as specified in the benchmark are generally met without any significant deficiency. For the second one, which is broadly implemented, the jurisdiction inability to provide affirmative responses to applicable key question for a particular CPICM under the CPICM broadly implemented benchmark. For the third one, which is partly implemented, the assessment criteria specified under the partly implemented benchmark for the CPICM are generally not met without any significant deficiencies. For the fourth one, which is not implemented when major shortcomings are found in the adhering of the assessment criteria as specified in not implemented benchmark. For the fourth one, which is not applicable, means it does not apply given the nature of the security market in the jurisdiction and relevant structural, legal, and institutional consideration.
So how is IFSB 21 guiding IFIS towards Sharia compliant activities? By guiding by with the absence of riba in the investment since it's prohibited in Islam. Next, by enhancing the concept of Islamic Sharia market tactics differentiation, market mix and its selling in detail, the standard gained global-wide acceptance and emerged as a challenge through Sharia compliance. Next, it increased popularity of a financial institution in Malaysia industry and market. Next, IFSB 21 provides a more clearer guidance for the regulation of Islamic capital markets for financial institutions. For example, CPICM as its IFSB member jurisdiction in the International Monetary Fund. Last, it guides Islamic financial institutions to perform all the useful functions of conventional capital markets with justice and equitable distribution of benefits. Thank you.
As for the conclusion, the core principles in new standards takes into consideration the specificity of Islamic finance by complementing the international standards that are principally issued by the IOSCO. Islamic Capital Market also provides minimum international standards for sound supervisory practice, and it also protects its consumers and stakeholders by ensuring Sharia compliance is made to any Islamic capital market product or services is sound and supported by the appropriate disclosures. It also enhances the soundness and stability of ICM, Islamic Capital Market, by assisting regulatory and supervisory authority to evaluate the quality for improvement. And finally, IFSB 21 will also be used by the jurisdiction as a benchmark for assessing the quality of regulatory and supervisory system